All right, now our next topic is the road to revolution, and it's going to span from the year 1770 to 1776. And so now we're really picking up in terms of this resistance and rebellion. And so I mentioned earlier the Sons of Liberty started in New York City. The leader was Samuel Adams. Now, Samuel Adams didn't necessarily participate directly in the actions of the Sons of Liberty, but he was definitely around when a lot of these actions were carried out, and he actually made a lot of the decisions uh, that went into these attacks. And so, what I have here is a video, and we'll probably get a chance to watch this in class, but this is a video or a clip from the episode of John Adams that shows where or what it was like to be tarred and feathered. Because typically, when you look at those cartoons or these sketches, it looks kind of silly, right? Like this guy, they're pouring stuff, down his mouth, and he has all these feathers on him. It's actually a very difficult thing to watch. Now, in 1770, we get the Boston Massacre. And so, what we have to understand about the Boston Massacre is the power of propaganda, right? 5 people are killed in this Boston Massacre. And so, what you have here in Boston is that people kind of surround the British Redcoats. And there's frustration because of a lack of jobs, lack of employment. There's frustration over taxes. And so, ultimately, what happens is that these colonists start to harass the redcoats. I mean, this is just the truth. The colonists start to harass the redcoats. They start to throw stones at them. At some point, the redcoats start to fire on the colonists, and the result is that 5 people are killed. Now, it's terrible that 5 people died, but it's also not a massacre, right? Like, whenever you consider the word massacre, you would think hundreds of people died. But the media called this the Boston Massacre for a reason, right? Because it would ultimately sway people in what they would hope to take a side on in this conflict in terms of whether you're going to support the colonists or you're going to support the British. Now, the first person killed in the Boston Massacre was a man by the name of Crispus Attucks, and he is a black American. So the first person killed for liberty as we lead up to the American Revolution was a black man who was not seen as equal in the colonies and whose people were not free. And so I ask you to consider here, how is the Boston Massacre used to garner support for the Patriots? Now, the Committees of Correspondence, that was a very important organization. And what it was they were basically these shadow governments that are set up all throughout the colonies. They're organized by colonists themselves. And so the purpose of the Committees of Correspondence was to warn the colonies about any incidents that take place with the British. All right, and so it's kind of like this secret society, I guess you could say, where they transmit information, they send letters and things like that, so that people can stay informed of what's going on with the British. And so what it is, it's a very well organized resistance movement. In 1773, the Tea Act is passed. And so I'll give you a little background on this. The British East India Company is a company of Great Britain. They basically have a monopoly on British tea imports. And because this company is a company of Great Britain, there's kind of this conflict of interest because a lot of members in Parliament actually own shares in the company. So they want this company to succeed. The problem, though, is that the company's on the verge of bankruptcy. They have a surplus of tea that they need to get rid of. And so what the Tea Act does is it allows the British East India Company to sell this tea to the colonies with no middleman. And so this makes the tea very cheap. All right, there's a surplus of tea they have to get rid of. If they don't sell this tea, the company will fold, and the members of Parliament that own shares in this company will lose all of their money. Right? And so what the Tea Act does is it doesn't make tea more expensive. It actually makes tea cheaper for the colonies. This is very important to understand because we traditionally are taught that the Boston Tea Party took place because there was a tax on tea, and the colonists didn't like that, and that's only partially true. The Tea Act made the tea cheaper, not more expensive. All right, and so the British really believed that the colonists would be happy about cheaper tea. But in 1773, we get the Boston Tea Party. All right, and that is when the Sons of Liberty board a ship. They are dressed as Native Americans. A lot of people, and their disguises weren't that great. A lot of people have suggested that maybe they dressed as Native Americans in order to show that they identify more as American than British at that point. But they dump that tea, millions and millions and millions of dollars of tea overboard. Now here's the thing. This is organized by Samuel Adams, right? Keep in mind, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, they're smugglers. So of course they don't want cheaper tea coming into the colonies. If the cheaper tea is coming into the colonies, that means it's going to hurt their pockets, right? But the Boston Tea Party is probably the most famous form of resistance as we lead up to the American Revolution. And so how did the British respond to the Boston Tea Party? They passed what's known as the Intolerable Acts. Now, in your book, it calls this the Coercive Acts. So you'll see it referred to as the Intolerable Acts or the Coercive Act. It's the exact same thing. And so these acts are in four different parts. The first thing is the Port Bill, and that closes the ports in the colonies until the British East India Company is reimbursed. So they have to be reimbursed for all of that tea that was dumped into the water. Then you have the Government Act. And what that is it brings about an end to town hall meetings. Sorry, y'all. You know I gotta drink my water. Now, these acts, the Intolerable Acts, particularly focused on dealing with Boston. All right, so Boston is going to be punished here because it's the Boston Tea Party. Not all the colonies will be punished, but the ports of Boston will be closed. The town hall meetings of Boston and throughout Massachusetts are going to be hindered. There's also a new quartering act. This is something that's going to impact all of the colonies, but mainly the Boston area because that's where a lot of the resistance is taking place. So a lot of the British redcoats will be in the Boston area. Again, the quartering act would be the housing of British redcoats. The fourth aspect of the Intolerable Acts would be the Administration of Justice Act. And what that means is that any trial of an accused royal official would take place in Britain and not in the American colonies. And so, for example, and this is just an example, but if a royal official killed an American colonist, that royal official would go back to Great Britain to face trial instead of facing trial in Boston. Right? And that's going to piss a lot of the colonists off because they feel as though their lives won't be as valued as the lives of someone who is actually working for the crown, right? And so that's going to lead to an issue in which they say that their lives matter as well, which is coincidental considering at that time that's a very patriotic principle, whereas today there's a lot of criticism about stuff like that. But I'm just going to sip on that. I'm just going to sip on it and go to the next slide. Anyway, another part of the laws that Great Britain passed, and this is not technically, it's not part of the Intolerable Acts, but it's rolled out at the same time as the Intolerable Acts, which is why this is here. That is the Quebec Act. All right, and remember, Quebec it's in Canada, and it had been part of the French Empire, but France lost Quebec after the French and Indian War. And so what this does is it provides religious freedom for French Canadians. And so that means that if they want to practice Catholicism, they can. All right, and so that's something that makes the British colonies very uncomfortable. But in addition to that, not only do they get religious freedom, but if you look at this map here, their land is expanding. And so you can see Quebec, how big Quebec used to be. And you can see that Quebec has now been expanded over into the Michigan area, right? And the Ohio Valley area. This again makes the colonists uncomfortable because now they have a Catholic colony that's bigger than the British colonies, right? Well, the 13 colonies, I should say, because the British actually control Quebec at this time. All right, and so this makes the 13 colonies very uncomfortable. Around 1774, we get the first Continental Congress, and that's where they have about 55 delegates from 12 colonies, and on the agenda is how do we respond to the Intolerable Acts and how do you respond to the Quebec Act. So these are things that they're starting to think about. How do they kind of organize resistance? One story that's very, very famous that you guys are probably familiar with is the story of Paul Revere and his midnight ride to warn the Minutemen of the approaching British. Uh, he's famous for saying the British are coming, the British are coming, and he wasn't the only one. There was a teenage girl actually who rode twice the distance of Paul Revere. I think she was about 16 years old, and she did the same thing. Paul Revere is the one who became famous because of his writing about that midnight ride, but also because he kind of had a certain status. He was very involved in the events leading up to the American Revolution. As a matter of fact, he is the one who created the artwork for the Boston Massacre that was depicted in articles and things like that all throughout the colonies. Now, April 8th, 1775, we get what's known as the shot heard round the world. And that is the issue at Lexington and Concord. And we're actually going to watch a video on that in class. Hopefully we'll have time to watch that. But I'm sure you guys learned about it last year. Again, it's known as the shot heard around the world because this is the birth of a nation. These are the first shots that are fired as part of the American Revolution. All right. Keep in mind, it's 1775, so no war has officially been declared, but these are the first shots of the American Revolution. And so ultimately what we have is that there are stockpiled weapons that the colonists have, and the British are trying to collect those weapons. All right, they're going to try to collect those weapons. That's why Paul Revere went on his midnight ride saying the British are coming, the British are coming. Now the colonists have to go, the militiamen of the colonists have to go and gather those weapons, and there's going to be a shootout. And you'll see that in the video that we watch. Now, following that, 1775, we have the Second Continental Congress. At the Second Continental Congress, the Olive Branch Petition is issued. And so what this is essentially is a peace offering from the colonists to King George III. But in doing so, they ask him to recognize some of their concerns. King George III is going to basically ignore this, especially because he's pissed off that any shots have been fired in the first place. He sees himself as the father, and these are disobedient children. All right. Also, at the Second Continental Congress, it is stated that George Washington will lead the Continental Army. He will lead the military. Now, was the American Revolution inevitable? A central figure of the American Revolution is Mercy Otis Warren. She is the head of Patriotic Women, and you know that there's something very powerful about so many people from different walks of life being involved in this American Revolution. And Mercy Otis Warren is a representation of the women's involvement in the American Revolution. And she's not the only woman that will be involved. There will be the Sons of Liberty, but there will also be the Daughters of Liberty. And Abigail Adams, who is the wife of John Adams, is highly political herself. She's going to stay home and raise the kids, but a lot of the decisions that John Adams is making leading up to these events and participating in this American Revolution are going to be influenced by his wife, and we know that from primary source documents because of the letters that they wrote each other. Now again, leading up to the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Paine writes, and Thomas Paine is my favorite founding father, by the way, not that y'all care, but whatever. Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet known as Common Sense. He wrote several pamphlets. I highly recommend you guys read them. You should read Common Sense. It's brilliant. The Rights of Man, it's brilliant. Anyway, only thing you need to know for the purpose of the class is common sense. And what Thomas Paine will say is that the cause of America is in great measure the cause of all mankind. The cause of America is in great measure the cause of all mankind. The reason I love Thomas Paine as a founding father is because he is pretty much the only founding father who was not a hypocrite. He tried his best to live by his principles and to live by his values. And he truly believed in human rights. And so that's why he said this statement. It's the cause of all mankind. that if we can get independence from these dictators, right, from the king, if we can get independence from the king, we can be the leaders of the free world. We can bring human rights, not only to the people of America, but to people throughout the world. Thomas Paine, uh, he hated slavery, and he also didn't own any slaves. He was very critical of organized religion and religious hypocrisy. Uh, and that's something that kind of impacted how he's interpreted in history. That's the reason why you're only taught about common sense. Matter of fact, the man who ignited the American Revolution, if you read this pamphlet, you'll see how he ignited that revolution. This idea that it's just simply common sense. It makes no sense for this small island across the Atlantic to control all of this land, to control all of these 13 colonies. It's common sense that there needs to be independence. That's what Thomas Paine will say. And he's going to ignite this American Revolution. He's the one that fires up the people. And when he dies, which will be years later, he'll live to see independence. But years later, when he dies, only 7 people attend his funeral. And it's because he criticized organized religion. Now, in 1776, we get the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is written by Thomas Jefferson, and it is edited by Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. All right. Now, how do we remember the Declaration of Independence in 1776? Well, it's written in Philadelphia, and that's why the Philadelphia's basketball team is known as the 76ers, because of the Declaration of Independence. Now, there is dispute over what should be our true Independence Day, whether it should be July 2nd or July 4th. Not that this is important for your test, I just think it's an interesting fact. John Adams believed that the day that would go down in history would be July 2nd. Obviously, he was wrong. We celebrate the 4th of July. Some of the major influences on the Declaration of Independence. We mentioned before John Locke, and remember he's an Enlightenment thinker. He is the one who talks about life, liberty, and property, and Thomas Jefferson will list that in the Declaration of Independence. He will list that as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so what the Declaration of Independence is, it is an assertion of natural laws and natural rights, this idea that we have natural human rights, this idea that all men are created equal. And it also lists grievances, right? Grievances meaning issues or problems or concerns that the king needs to deal with. The most famous line from the Declaration of Independence: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And it's important that they use the word creator. They use the word creator for a reason. A lot of our founding fathers were deists. What that means is that they didn't necessarily believe in an organized religion, but they believed that there was a God, maybe from their perspective, and that God was had a very hands-off approach. That God was not directly involved in the interactions of human beings. And so they use the word creator as kind of this catch-all, right? Like whatever you think or whoever you think created life here, no matter what that is or who that is, we all have unalienable rights. And unalienable rights are things that cannot be taken away. No one can ever take those rights away. Now, there are 4 basic principles of the Declaration of Independence. First, all men are created equal. All people are created equal. All people have basic rights that cannot be taken away. That's what we call unalienable rights. This idea that the government gets its power from the people. The only reason the government has power is because we allow the government to rule over us. And when the government is not doing their job, or when they're not respecting the rights of the people, it's the people that have the right to change or abolish the government. Now, who did they leave out of the Declaration of Independence? They left out slaves, or black people, and they also left out women. Now, what's interesting about the Declaration of Independence, though, is that the initial draft of the Declaration of Independence actually includes slavery. And Thomas Jefferson, the man who owned hundreds of slaves himself, actually wrote in the original version of the Declaration of Independence that America would be better than Great Britain, that America would abolish slavery. So Thomas Jefferson, he's another one of my favorite founding fathers because he recognized his own conflict. He knew he was a flawed man. He knew that slavery was wrong, but he was also a product of his time, right? He was so conditioned to practice slavery and to own these slaves. And so he wasn't strong enough to give that up, but he was willing to do it when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. Now, how did this get taken out of the Declaration of Independence? Remember, I said Benjamin Franklin and John Adams edited the Declaration of Independence. So it was Benjamin Franklin and John Adams that removed it, even though they didn't believe in slavery at all. Neither one of them believed in slavery. But the reason they removed it is because they didn't want the South to not support the war. If you abolish slavery, if you put that in the Declaration of Independence, then the war, the American Revolution, becomes about slavery. And the South will not fight to end slavery because the South is dependent on slavery. Now here's a STAAR question. The ideas contained in the Declaration of Independence helped, and you can take some time to look at those responses. At this time, hopefully you have an answer to that question. The correct answer is B. Inspire people in other countries to question the authority of their government, because that's pretty much what the colonists did. They questioned the authority of the king. They held the king accountable. They said the king is not representing the people, so they can remove or abolish the king. And that's what they did. They formed a whole other country. Now, this is information that you don't necessarily need to know for the AP exam, but these are important people for the STAAR. They've never asked about these people before at all, but they are in the state standard. And so Hancock, and these are people that signed the Declaration of Independence. Hancock was known as the president of the Second Continental Congress. He also had the largest signature of the Declaration of Independence. Rush is known as the father of American medicine, and he helped to establish the AME Church. So Texas wants you guys to know that because he's a religious figure, and he's he's actually one of the few founding fathers that was devoutly religious. All of the founding fathers have been religious at some point, but as they got older, a lot of them shifted to become more deist. Carroll. He financed the revolution. He actually paid for the American Revolution. He's also the only Catholic, and he was the longest living founding father. He lived up to 95 years old. Now, he paid for the American Revolution, and we never paid him back. He went bankrupt. We never paid him back. But yeah, that's just the American way. Witherspoon. He was the president of New Jersey College, which is today known as Princeton. So all of those people signed the Declaration of Independence. Jonathan Trumbull Sr., he was the only colonial governor who supported the colonists. He was also a very close friend of Washington. And here are our new national symbols. Probably the thing that you're most familiar with, or the items you're most familiar with, the Liberty Bell, and particularly this Don't Tread on Me flag. We see that a lot today with the Tea Party, even though it's kind of used incorrectly. They misinterpret history, but whatever. And that's a wrap. Now we're going to move into the actual American Revolution.